So thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome our General Counsel and VP for Environmental, Social and Governance Sustainability and Compliance Risk with IFC, Mr. Ethiopis Tafara, to make some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Alejandro. So on behalf of the IFC management team, it's my pleasure to welcome Ashesi's President, Dr. Patrick Awuah, to welcome Ashesi's Foundation Board of Trustees and staff, to welcome today's speakers and moderators of the panel on innovation in Sub-Saharan African higher education, and obviously to welcome IFC and World Bank participants. IFC is honored to host this year's annual event for Ashesi University College and Ashesi Foundation, and take this opportunity to focus the conversation on the critical importance of education to Africa's future. Africans are grappling with many of the massive shifts affecting developing countries: globalization of supply chains, urbanization, expansion of internet connectivity and mobile technologies, and the emergence of middle class, even if from a low base. And automation and new technology are rapidly changing the skills needed for a 21st century labor force. It's creating a situation where employers often have positions that they need to fill, but can't find enough qualified people to take them due to skill shortages in the local economy. At the same time, youth unemployment is unacceptably high. In 2010, an estimated 350 million youths were not in school, not employed, and not in training. And Africa is a very young continent with 60% of the population under the age of 25. Education to fit the demands of the 21st century is the surest pathway to opportunities for social mobility and escaping poverty for these young people. And education is the pathway to Africa's future productive growth. In Africa, less than 10% of students go on to tertiary education, compared with around 30% on average for Latin America. And such low numbers for Africa is a cumulative effect of a number of challenges. Global demand for education is soaring, but many governments in emerging markets don't have resources to offer education to all its citizens. This is particularly true in a context where governments face conflicting social sector priorities, whether it be education, health, and social protection. And quality of education is often weak. An estimated 250 million primary and secondary school-aged children cannot read and write. Just closing these gaps requires massive increases in education investment from both the public and private sources. The private sector is in fact expected to be a key contributor to expanding capacity of educational systems, according to many experts. Ashesi University is a stellar example of the role the private sector is already playing in providing high-quality college education to African students. The university is a private, secular, and not-for-profit liberal arts college in Accra. It was established in 2002 and has since gained a reputation for offering high-quality undergraduate education to African students, boasting over 90% employment rate for its graduates. Ethics and social equity are central to the university's philosophy and how it operates. The university promotes equitable access to tertiary education through inclusive admission practices and scholarships for students from low-income families. More than half of the university students receive partial or full scholarships thanks to donors and thanks to allocating 20% of tuition revenue for financial aid. The university's long-term goal is to operate a world-class university that can educate a new generation of ethical and entrepreneurial leaders in Africa under an innovative liberal arts model centered around 21st century skills. The mission is to begin the transformation of the country and the region through its graduates. The name, Ashesi, means beginning, in the native Ghanaian language, Akan, beginning of Africa's transformation through quality education and beginning of a better life for each student. I understand it also holds a personal call to action for the university's founder, Dr. Patrick Awuah, who left a software engineering career at Microsoft in the US to return to his native Ghana to start Ashesi. IFC is proud to be supporting the university in its mission to help transform Ghana and the African continent, and look forward to a continued partnership with Ashesi for many years to come to continue to support and witness the transformation of the university is working to achieve. In just a few minutes, we'll hear from Dr. Awuah about the opportunities and challenges he sees along this path. We'll also hear insights from two prominent leaders in emerging markets and U.S. higher education. Doug Becker, founder, chairman, and CEO of Laureate Education, the world's leading network of higher education institutions, over 1 million students enrolled. Dr. Vincent Mano, provost and dean of faculty at Olin School of Engineering, an institution that the World Bank considers to be an example of innovation and pedagogical transformation. And we'll hear the perspectives from Xian Yang, lead education specialist at the World Bank, focusing on Sub-Saharan African higher education, and from two senior IFC colleagues who have been closely involved in IFC's work with Ashesi, Ronke Amoni Ongulslere, country manager for Ghana, and Randi, I don't know if I can pronounce your last name. Thank you. Just like it's spelled. You try it. Finally, I'd like to thank many people who made this event possible, from our panelists and moderators to staff from Ashesi, IFC, and World Bank. Thank you. And so without further delay, I pass the floor on to Alejandro Caballero, Principal Education Specialist at IFC and a core member of the IFC team working with Ashesi, and Michael Est, Senior Private Sector Specialist at the World Bank and team leader for Ashesi's Ghana Climate Innovation Center project. They'll moderate our panel. And with that, over to you, Alejandro and Michael.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much, Ethiopis, for this very nice introduction. And I think you've done also most of the presentations and introductions here. So I'll just be very, very brief. I mean, my left to right, I mean, Mr. Doug Becker, Dr. Vincent Manos, Xiaoyan Liang from the World Bank, and Andy Rajakumaran from IFC Credit Team. And obviously, last but obviously not least, Patrick Awuah from Ashesi University, and Ronke, Ronke Amoni Ogunslire from country manager for IFC in Ghana, and obviously my colleague Mike, who will be moderating. So I'll jump straight into the discussion with a question for Xia Yang regarding the current situation of higher education in Sub-Saharan Africa. What do you think, Xia Yang, are the challenges for the sector and the current opportunity that innovation can play in the region?
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Good afternoon. My name is Xiaoyan. I'm from the World Bank. I have to say that I'm fairly new in the Africa region. I was just recently focusing on our East Asia portfolio and moved over to the J building. Now I'm the task team leader for the Eastern and Southern Africa, our Centers of Excellence project. I'm here also to speak on behalf of my twin colleague, Andreas, who is the TTO for the west side of the African Centers of Excellence. It will be difficult for me to say the challenges in 2 to 3 minutes. I think I'm just going to add some numbers to the overview opening speech. Africa, there was a huge expansion in higher education, but even now we have still below 10% of the enrollment in tertiary education. Of that 10%, we have only 1/3 female, and most of 10% are people from well-to-do families, relatively well-to-do families. And of the 10%, we only have about 20% enrollment in STEM fields. So most of the enrollment is actually in social science, law, and education, being the main focus of the fields of studying Africa. These are some of the macro conditions we have, and of course, in terms of quality, Africa as a continent produces only 1% of total global scientific research, and even that is done jointly, mostly with the other international co-authors and co-researchers. So, and graduates, we did a benchmarking recently of the 31 universities under part of our ACE, looking at different dimensions of the quality and challenges. I'm just going to quickly share a little bit more. A lot of schools are on strike. Quite strikingly, we talk about maximum of 60 days, the campus, a student on strike or faculty on strike. We have a serious lack of facilities, especially in IT facilities, and faculty barely half, I think it's about 45% faculty actually have doctorate degrees. So we have quite serious challenges. I hope in terms of innovation, I think I'm mainly here going to introduce the World Bank project, the Center of Excellence. Perhaps I have another opportunity to do so later on in the panel to see that whether that can be a vehicle or platform for innovation in higher education, or in the science research fields. Thank you. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Sirian. Much appreciated. And just a quick question for Doug. Doug, what do you think should be the role of the private sector, in particular in the Sub-Saharan African country? I think you've looked at many regions. You know a lot from the experience of Laureate in Latin America. You've looked at the Sub-Saharan African continent, that IFC has supported you to actually do that. How do you see the situation for the private sector in Africa, and what did you learn from the Laureate experience?
Sure, and thanks so much for inviting me to participate in the panel. So earlier it was mentioned we have a million students in about 70 universities that we operate or own around the world, heavily in Latin America, but especially in many emerging markets, including we do operate in South Africa and in Morocco, haven't been otherwise as extensively engaged in Africa as I would hope. Generally, in the countries where we operate, the public capacity, the government capacity, is very difficult to expand. And so the private sector is welcomed in many countries to increase capacity, to create seats of capacity in higher education in countries that have a target for participation rate above the current level. But that assumes that a form of user fee can be afforded in that market. And in many countries it can, especially as the fragile emerging middle classes become a little bit more robust. The challenge for us in Africa is that we've seen that the fragility and the lack of depth in those who can afford is greater than I had anticipated, and not growing at the rate necessary to succeed. And therefore, it still seems today that in many countries it will require government funding or some other form of funding, maybe employer supported. There are other models that are being attempted in various places. But what we're finding is that the private capacity in Africa is still affordable only at a fee level that does not often deliver the quality that's necessary. So for a company like ours, very reputation-oriented, we can't actually manufacture the product at the cost that people can afford in many countries. So what do? We have a fantastic university in South Africa, which was started originally by Monash University in Australia. They then realized that the difficulty of a globally ranked top 100 university, public university in Australia, running a branch campus in South Africa was not easy for them. And they actually invited us to take over the operations in partnership with them, and we operate that today. We have about 4,000 students there today. We deliver, I think, an exceptionally high-quality education for somewhere around $5,000 a year. It's the same degree you would spend almost 10 times that amount to get if you went to Australia to get this globally ranked degree. And we also accept students from all over Africa who will come to South Africa. But as a result, it is a relatively affluent community. We do our best to raise funds and to give away. Essentially, all of the profits of that institution are devoted to bursary support for students. But we just aren't making the impact that we would like. So I just hope that's a helpful framing of the issue. The private sector can play a role, but we're going to need a breakthrough either in a less expensive model to educate, perhaps technology-driven, or seeing the affordability factor improve in the private markets that exist.
Okay, and Doug, a quick follow-up question. Do you see what you achieved in Latin America at some point happening in Africa? And maybe what's the time frame for that?
I think there's a trigger point where the affordability and the quality can meet. So, and in each country it's a different number, but I would say generally speaking around the world, when I see markets where students can't afford to pay more than, let's say, $1,000 a year for a university education, generally my feeling is it's going to be very hard to deliver the quality. The real cost is simply going to be higher than that to be sustainable, to get good outcomes, to find and attract good faculty. And with real estate and other facilities, again, it's going to have to be some sort of blending of a public and a private source of funding. When you begin to get above that level, you can actually begin to at least attempt to deliver something of some quality. And there are entrepreneurial, scrappy ventures all over Africa where people are doing this, and they show us with pride the university that they have that's teaching at $500 a year of tuition. And I look at it and I say, I'm grateful for their students that they're doing it. I couldn't put our name on it, not yet. So we just need to see that level get to a little bit higher. For us in Latin America, our average tuition is probably somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year. On the one hand, that's astronomically higher than what we're seeing could be afforded at scale in Africa. On the other hand, it's not that much money. And the efficiency, our ability to deliver good outcomes at that price, I think we've been able to demonstrate.
Okay, thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Doug and Shannon. My question is for Patrick. So given this context that we've heard, many difficulties with the higher education system in Africa, some optimism coming from Latin America, but also some difficulties in translating that to Africa, where does Ashesi fit into this? How does the Ashesi model serve as a potential example, or is it a unique type of institution? And talk a little bit more about Ashesi's model, including how it both improves quality and relevance within Africa higher education, but also something that's kind of close to my heart, how it actually has an impact on the economy through promoting entrepreneurship and innovation.
Okay. So I think I couldn't agree more with Doug. The context for me before we settled on setting up a university in Ghana was actually I was trying to set up a software company in Ghana. I was thinking about it and then found out that there were students in college who were not using computers and studying computer science. And that's what's affordable when the tuition is so low. You can't actually equip computer labs, you can't maintain machines, and so on. And so when we were getting started, we were very clear that this was going to be a high-quality institution. And we didn't want to take any risks about that, right? So that was, quality had to be there. And today, one of the ways we measure our quality, in addition to students getting good jobs on the continent, is when we send a student getting A's at Ashesi as an international exchange student to the U.S., and they get to an Ivy League quality school here, are they getting A's here as well? Or if they're working in a multinational anywhere in the world or anywhere in Africa, are they meeting the bar? The way we've achieved that quality is, I would say, just two or three things. One is making sure that the curriculum is a modern one. And by modern, I mean that it's a curriculum that is informed by the needs of the private sector. Before we started to draw up any curriculum, we did focus groups with leaders, business leaders, social sector leaders, people from faith-based organizations, even military. Say, what should this education look like? And made sure that the curriculum that we drew up met the needs of the market, if you will, or the world of work. The second thing was to borrow from pedagogy from top institutions in the United States, which I think has one of the strongest higher ed systems in the world. And specifically looking at the liberal education of saying that, if you want to educate leaders, that you want to educate them broadly. So they have sort of a breadth of disciplines to draw on and make connections. You want to, employ the technique of the Socratic method. You want to make sure students are doing real projects in class and so on. So pedagogy is very important. And then finally, you have to have a strong campus culture. And that means that we have to have a very close engagement with students. Our student-faculty ratio, it's not what an Ivy League institution would be. Here it's about 10 to 1. We're at 20 to 1. But we didn't want to get a student-faculty ratio that was too high, because then we wouldn't have that direct touch with our students. So those were three, I would say, broad things. And you talked about entrepreneurship. We have a set of courses that are designed to sort of foster an entrepreneurial mindset. You know, they take a course in design thinking and entrepreneurship in their first year. They design products, they design businesses, they run business on campus for that first year. And then it's sort of an experience that they carry through the rest of their 4 years, as an example. But I also want to say that actually a pedagogy that challenges students to take academic risk, intellectual risks in class, share ideas with others, challenge others, ask questions and listen, also helps people sort of get their risk profile changes, right? And entrepreneurship is a lot about being able to challenge the status quo, right, which is risky, being able to imagine something new, which involves risks, being able to take that thing you've imagined and actually work to make it real, which is sort of the ultimate risk. You know, you might fail and so on. But it all starts with, you know, get them taking risks in class and then take it from there.
Maybe, if you don't mind, a quick follow-up too, just to hear maybe a little bit more about the Ashesi financial model in light of Doug's comments. Going a little off script, but I know you've come the farthest. So,
right. So our financial model, we always intended that Ashesi would be accessible, in addition to being high quality. And so we built a business model that basically gets us to be self-sustaining on the basis of tuition, but also, absent any philanthropy, we would subsidize fully 20% of students on full tuition scholarships, absent philanthropy. And then we raise philanthropic money to get that number to be higher. And that's the model that we've had. Now, fortunately, we've been quite successful at getting philanthropic funding for scholarships, and now about 50% of our students get scholarships. There were a couple of years when we didn't have a lot of money, and that model was really tested. And we did, in fact, achieve break-even. We did, in fact, have 20% equivalent of full tuition scholarships spread across 35% of the student body. We were running on our own steam at that point. And so for us, it's really important. Diversity is important. Inclusion is important. Our female enrollment is 48%. Some classes will have 51% women, 49% men, but on average over the whole institution is 48% women. And we pay attention to that.
Great, thanks. Next question is for Ronke. And I just wanted to hear from you, Ronke, about how Ashesi fits into Ghana's development context, and why Ashesi is a university that the World Bank and the IFC are both supporting now and interested in supporting from a development standpoint.
So Ashesi, it interests us so much because it fits perfectly. It's consistent with the government of Ghana's development priorities and also the World Bank Group's priorities. And there are a number of ways that can be highlighted. I think a number of them were mentioned by Ethiopius in his speech. It basically increases competitiveness of the labor force. So when you're Ashesi is putting out high quality graduates with good education, good exposure into the labor force, it's increasing competitiveness and it's attracting investors. And we know that when investors are looking for where they're going to place operations, they're looking for places where they're trained people. And attracting investors is central to the new government's strategy. They talk about it all the time, as Ethiopians and I were at an event recently, and that's the first thing that the Vice President says and works very hard at. Another thing that interests us so much in Ashesi is the inclusiveness that Patrick has talked about. 50% of students being supported. And that means you can reach all socioeconomic groups. You can really reach the poorest that wouldn't have the opportunity. Another thing is that it's a competitive alternative to sending children abroad, if you can say that. In Ghana, like in many countries in Africa, parents that can afford it will send their kids abroad, with the belief that they'll get a better education. And when they come back, yes, they tend to be sought after more than the students that have gone to universities locally. And I've interacted with the two groups of students, the students that studied locally and the students that have gone abroad. And my view is that they're both very well educated in their subject matter. The students who have gone abroad perhaps have a little bit of an edge just in sort of the way they think about things, the sort of critical thinking, problem solving, the flexibility, and so on. And it's very interesting to see that Ashesi graduates actually have that edge as well. And I say this because they're actually Ashesi graduates that work in the IFC office in Accra. And it is such a pleasure. And when I say pleasure, it's an absolute pleasure working with them, really. So that, that's, I think that's an important advantage. Another thing is that it's a model that works. It's 90%, I think we heard, of graduates get jobs within 6 months after national service. I mean, that's an amazing, amazing result when you consider that youth unemployment in Ghana sometimes is as high as 50%. For these reasons, we really, really love the Ashesi model. It's consistent with the government's development priorities, consistent with our priority, and it works.
Thanks very much, Ronke. I'm always a bit conflicted when I hear of the best and brightest coming to work with us, the World Bank. They need to be also in the rest of the economy. But
we didn't take all of them.
Yes, I know. Ashesi's churning out quite enough students now. We can pick off a few. So, my next question is for Anandi. And one of the things that's unique about Ashesi's model is, as Patrick said, there is quite a bit of philanthropic funding now. It's not necessarily a necessity, but it's now using quite a bit of philanthropic funding. What are some of the lessons that you've learned in your work as a credit officer at IFC in leveraging philanthropic funding?
Sure. So we've seen a lot of different models, and I would say Ashesi is different than most of the models we see in Latin America. In Latin America, as you know, there's a little bit different. Some of the qualities in some of the public institutions and the private institutions are often going for a volume approach at a low cost based on accessibility. We have a number of clients in Argentina, Colombia, and in Central America that are trying to take donor money and have a multiplicative effect with it. So you can take a donor dollar and you can spend it in this year and actually fund scholarships and have an immediate impact on students' lives and accessibility. But you can also take that donor money and try to leverage it and use institutions like the IFC and other banks using it as collateral so that companies can really expand and do more for their students and perhaps build larger universities, which will give access to more students eventually. So I think it's a tough trade-off as you look at that. I also work in the agri sector, and I think IFC has a recent program called the GAFSP, which takes donor funding and has enabled us to do a lot more smaller transactions, especially in Africa and in some fragile countries. And I think it's something that we could definitely do for health and education. I think health and education is also a sector where, unlike manufacturing and other large goods, it's a services sector with a lot of development impact that could use that kind of donor money for either first losses or for other creative solutions. And I think we'll be moving in that direction to try to make each donor dollar go farther.
Just a quick follow-up, Anandi. Do you see opportunities with the new private sector window at IFC? And maybe you can explain a little bit what that is.
I think that's something many of us who work on this sector are pushing for. So I would say yes. I think we have a new director who's covering that, and it's something those of us working on Africa in H&E sector are definitely, moving towards that we could do something similar with that. Some of what that window is going to do is going to be larger scale transformational work with the World Bank and opening markets. But I think this is an innovation that we could definitely use for health and education. So I think the private sector window will open up that opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Anandi. Yeah, I have a quick question for Vincent. And I mean, you represent Olin, and Olin is an extremely innovative institution, and we'd love to hear a little bit about the model. We also understand that Olin has been interacting both with the World Bank and with Ashesi, and that there are strong connections on that front. We'd love to hear from you on that front, Vincent. And maybe the question is how can we learn from Olin? I mean, given that we're all here in the higher education space.
Well, thank you for the question. I think in listening to the answers, and especially listening to Patrick, I think Olin has a lot to learn from Ashesi. In many ways, I feel that we are kindred institutions, and because of our philosophy. As far as Olin College of Engineering is concerned, many things that Patrick said about Ashesi and what was some of the underlying principles are exactly what we were about. Very much that culture, the campus culture and the institutional culture are critical. I guess what's special about Olin is that it is in the field of engineering, which is not exactly the field that people would expect to be the field that would lead the charge in changing education. So I'm a bit of a radical on that in the sense that I believe engineering is the perfect discipline and area to do this if you can redefine what engineering is. So at Olin, we define engineers as people that imagine what doesn't exist and will do anything to make it happen. If you take that, then it is very much about empowerment. And the question is, how do you craft an educational system or a set of learning experiences where students are empowered, where as they go through their educational program, they actually feel that after every course and every experience, they could do more than what they did before, as opposed to receiving the rather negative message of you just don't know enough to do something. It is amazing. If you don't tell students what they can't do, they will do amazing things. And the idea, especially in engineering, that you need to bulk up on an incredible amount of math and science before you can practically do anything is actually the exact opposite. So what we're looking for is to bring out in students a sense of empowerment, a sense of owning their own education, and a sense, and I think Patrick used the word impact, a sense that they will have an impact, and there has to be a reason for what they're doing. This is true across the board, but with the millennial generation, and I understand this is another undercurrent, this is a generation who doesn't believe or does in multiple imaginary steps in between the now and what I'm supposed to be doing with what I'm learning. And very much, they don't believe you. You have to demonstrate them, and then they demonstrate it for themselves. So I do not feel that Olin is unique in any way, but it certainly is distinctive. And what our goal is to be a catalyst for change, demonstrate the real outcomes, and our students are our primary outcomes. We're a small, idiosyncratic little school with 355 students. And obviously what we do, some of what we do cannot be adopted, but to a large part, a lot of what we do can be adapted to the culture and the situations that people have. So I think the underlying aspect is we're trying to figure out what is the proper foundational education, perhaps for a profession, but more for an engaged life. And we feel that in that way, what we're doing, that an engineering core, but very well, but a broad-based core is instead of what you might call liberal education, what I like to call liberating education.
Okay, and maybe Vincent, could you give a specific example in which this reciprocal learning between Olin and Ashesi has taken place? Maybe just to illustrate.
Sure.
A little bit
In many ways, I think institutionally we're related. In many ways, when I think of Patrick, I think of our founding president, Rick Miller, and I think Rick and Patrick are kindred people. In very practical ways, we have had what's grown out of relationships and conversations over the years have been activities. I was very privileged and pleased to be part of the advisory panel for the group that put together the first engineering curriculum for Ashesi University. We've been happy to have Ashesi colleagues join us in our own summer institutes and other workshops as they've developed their curriculum. So we've had our professors and our students go to Ashesi to run development workshops and other workshops with students. And we have some very personal relationships, as in Patrick was kind enough to be our commencement speaker just this past Sunday. And the current provost at Ashesi was kind enough to allow her daughter to attend Olin. So we have many, many connections.
Okay. And thanks so much, Vincent. And question for Patrick. Patrick, how do you see Ashesi moving forward? I mean, what's going to be different in the institution maybe 5-10 years from now? And what are some of the innovations that you're trying to promote at Ashesi?
All right. So 5-10 years from now, there are a set of things that we've started to do that will start to yield results. So the first Vincent just talked about is this engineering program we started. And for that program, we have, a goal in addition to educating ethical entrepreneurial leaders, also educating inventors. And so 5 to 10 years from now, I would hope that we would see some of the graduates of that engineering program designing, inventing, creating solutions for our problems, solutions for people, which is also a focus of Olin's. We also just enrolled, we just selected 11 startups from 5 regions in Ghana that are going to come through training in the Climate Innovation Center, which is funded by the World Bank. And so we've just started an effort to reach out to entrepreneurs outside of the university. So, we want to be a university without walls, without borders between us and our community. And again, I would hope that 5 to 10 years from now that we see, 50 to 100 companies that have sort of been incubated at Ashesi in the specific area of climate, the challenges that come with climate change in energy and water and sanitation and climate smart agriculture. And then also in 5 to 10 years, we're at 800 students growing at 100 students a year, that I would expect that we would be at, 1,200, 1,500 students, that we would have added majors, training people specifically for the policy side of things for government, because right now a lot of our majors are targeted towards the private sector. And that's going to actually change our STEM and non-STEM ratios a bit. Currently, about 60% of our freshman class are STEM. When we add econ major and maybe public policy, I think it's going to shift back to maybe 50% or so. That's where I see us going.
And how do you see Ashesi influencing the higher education landscape, both in Ghana and more broadly in the region, now that you're targeting increasing your international students to 30%, which is a very large number?
Right. So there's some. When we started, we had this goal that we would influence other universities. And when we started, it was something like 5% of college-age people in Ghana and across the continent were going to college. And we figured if you change how that small percentage is educated, you fast forward 20, 30 years, they're in their 40s and 50s, they're running their countries, right? But that 5% was not just Ashesi, it's Ashesi and all the other universities. So we've always had this ambition that we would influence what other universities do. And up to now, that influence has happened in a couple of ways. One has been just purely passive, just sort of demonstration effect. But the second is sort of pushing our model and getting the accreditation board in Ghana to accept our model to a point where they've moved from initially asking us to get rid of the core curriculum to now asking other universities, do you have a core curriculum? Now, we hope that that question will change to, why don't you have a core curriculum? And maybe you must have a core curriculum. So influencing policymakers. We've decided that we're going to take a more proactive approach to trying to share with others and taking lessons from Olin's collaboratory, the Summer Institute. We're piloting our first Summer Institute this year in June. And the goal is to have 10 universities present and share what we're doing and listen to them about and find out what are they most interested in about Ashesi, figure out how we distill what we do in a way that we fine-tune it so that we can run this institute for many more years and in a more proactive way influence what others are doing. I also hope that we'll learn from others, right? So it's always a sort of a two-way street. If we're successful, you think about scale. Scale is going to be done by the government and by the market. It's not going to be done by any one institution or any 2 or 3 institutions. It's a whole market that does it. But if we can influence what the market is doing, then we achieve scale. I also have, as the founder, sort of a maybe not so secret reason for driving this is that for me, one of the worst things that could happen is that, a couple decades from now, Ashesi starts to decline. And in any market, there's always a regression towards the mean, right? You sort of trend towards the mean. And so we need to lift the mean up, and we need to lift the trajectory of the mean to point the nose up. And then I know that Ashesi will be challenged, even when I'm not there, to continue to be great. So the fact that we have issues in quality is kind of a market failure. And if we can act in such a way that we can correct that market failure, then we set the whole society on a different trajectory. And we're doing this sort of Africa-wide. So we're inviting universities from outside Ghana as well.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Very interesting. Ronki, one quick question for you as well. I mean, you followed Ashesi from the very early days, and I'm sure you have some ideas, suggestions, recommendations for Patrick on how to maybe increase the relevance of the institution for the Ghanaian economy. What could you, if I were to ask you maybe 2 or 3 specific things, what would you recommend, Patrick?
I think Patrick knows already. He knows everything already. I think we need more Ashesi graduates. We need them to be influencing more in the workplace. So it's scaling up the model, scaling up reach. And it's not just increasing the number of students, it's keeping that ratio, it's keeping that quality, it's keeping that special touch, that edge, and it's not an easy thing to do. And so maybe what you were talking about of influencing other universities. How can we get other universities to look at the similar model to get that vision out there? And then maybe another thing too is how do we make it even more relevant to the in the Ghanaian context? I think that maybe I'll use engineering as an example. Maybe some people would say that at Ghana's stage of development today, perhaps it's not that we need engineers that can design things, but we need people that really can maintain. So are we going to have, is it really realistic to think that in development today, Ghanaian engineers will be designing cars? Or should they be just really, or people should be really, really good at sort of repairing cars? That's a question. And so, well, if I could use my own personal experience, I studied engineering as well. And I think it was a very good degree to do. It opened doors for me, it got me good jobs. The analytical thinking is great. But when I compare myself to a friend who studied engineering and then went and got a diploma, a vocational diploma, so could really repair things and get into things, the experience, I think that combination was extremely powerful. He ended up going to set up a business in Nigeria, my home country, where he to basically repair and maintain generators. And if anyone knows Nigeria, generators very, very, very important. In fact, my mother accuses my father of loving the generator more than his children. But anyway, that's a different story. But so he set up a business maintaining and repairing generators and air conditioners, and is making an absolute killing because he obviously has brought this engineering discipline and knowledge and also has the technical side, and he's training people, employing lots of people. There's the whole entrepreneurial side. So it's not that Ashesi should be a vocational school. No, I think there are other people doing that. But is there some kind of innovation that we can think about where we bring a little bit more of that vocational side for the context of Ghana? Maybe a thought. Do you want to answer that before we...
Sure, absolutely. Sure, over to Patrick.
All right. So actually, I do have an answer to that. When we think about invention, we also think about tinkering, right? So to really be a good inventor, you have to be someone who's experimenting and building things and taking them apart and so on. And so our program has actually a very hands-on component to it. Freshmen start designing and building things. I mean, they're cutting metal. There's some things that they design and 3D print, but there are things where they're sort of cutting material and riveting and all of that stuff, putting together circuits. Now, the reason I think this is important, I look at Africa today, and you look at, say, the mobile phone phenomenon in Africa, and we like to say we leapfrogged from the landlines. And this is partly true, but it's also partly not true. We didn't leapfrog. We're all carrying these computers in our pockets, right? None of them was built in Africa. The hundreds of millions of devices on the continent, none built in Africa, none designed in Africa. We have mobile telephony networks that reach every village in Ghana. None of the equipment that enable that network is built in Ghana, or anywhere in Africa for that matter. And it's built in China. And why is it built in China? Because back when we didn't anticipate mobile phones and all of this stuff, they were educating their engineers at the highest level possible in their country. We don't know what the world is going to look like 10, 20 years from now. But the next time there's a phenomenon like this, I really think that Africa should be ready, and Africa should be part of building it. And so this is why I think it's really important to not, and we had this debate, not within our organization, but with other universities saying, look, why do you have a goal of invention? You should just educate engineers who can put together systems based on machines that others have invented and maintain them. But I don't think that's enough, because we don't know what's going to be 10, 20 years from now. And we need to prepare them for that world.
Thanks. Just a comment that I think one of the new revolutions beyond mobile phones now that is sweeping across Africa is renewable energy, off-grid energy, and these type of things. And I think one of the reasons that we always envisioned the Climate Innovation Center being such a good fit with the Ashesi is because it enables African entrepreneurs to become part of that revolution and not miss out like maybe it was done with mobile phones. Question for Vin. We talked a little bit about how Ashesi and Olin exchange ideas and models. What are some of your lessons about transferring models of higher education innovations across geographies? And for the benefit of the World Bank and IFC here, what can we do to help support that, if anything?
And if you don't mind, I just want to react to something that Patrick said, which is absolutely right as far as the idea of an education that prepares students to be proactive about what might come down, what new things might evolve, and the idea of the hands-on. It's a very important. It's something that actually we unfortunately in the United States bred out of our engineering education. It became a very engineering in the United States morphed from engineering to applied science, which is actually different. Engineering is more of a way of thinking than it is a body of knowledge, and to think about what engineers could be properly educated, not only problem solving. I think engineering education has the potential to be the problem formulation profession, not only the problem solving profession. As far as things to what can be transferred or learned from Olin and what the World Bank and other organizations should do, one thing that I would say to our friends and colleagues at Ashesi to think about, that we have to go through and continuing to go through, is something you said, Patrick, is how to keep the innovative spirit and this goal orientation as Ashesi ages as an institution, as it no longer has that blank sheet of paper, as you start to have things to conserve. Very easy to be a curricularly innovative environment when it's a blank sheet of paper as opposed to things that you become taken with. So how do you build not only a student culture, but in this regard, even though I think we both come from student-centric institutions, this is a faculty culture issue. How do you evolve a faculty who are committed to constant change and innovation instead of the preservation of the now? And how do you build your reward and recognition systems for faculty to encourage that as outcome so that they are swimming with the stream instead of moving upstream? As far as what external organizations as the World Bank and IFC can be involved with, it actually is to encourage experimentation, is not look for programs with very specific outcomes, to actually encourage experimentation and see what can be learned from those experiments. Often, both in the United States and certainly with schools that we've worked with in other parts of the country, it is not unusual that the Ministry of Education is more the problem than it is part of the solution. And I say that in all seriousness. And it's not that they are trying to do evil. It is that they are trying to do good, but how they define good and the bounds of it are very much settled in the now. And if you're in a change and innovative environment, the now is not what should drive. It should be more of an entrepreneurial mindset and a thing, and letting data. So what else can people do? Fund true assessment, fund longitudinal studies, fund studies to see what is different about the life trajectories of Ashesi graduates compared to other places, so that that data can drive decisions as opposed to preconceived notions.
Thanks. Anandi, with your position in the IFC, I know that you've worked in quite a number of different education markets, and one of them that you have, I think, extensive experience with is Brazil. We just wanted to hear about some of the innovations you see within the Brazilian higher education market and how that might vary from Ashesi or the African education models you've seen.
So the Brazilian market's very different, a very large market, and you have a lot of the quality actually in the public sector. Unfortunately, as you look at access, what you have is students who have the money and are educated in private secondary schools are the ones who test well enough to get into those very good public schools. And so the private sector really is the one providing the accessibility. But with a large population, it's driven by volume and not necessarily by quality. It's driven by volume, and they're all listed companies. And so I think there is a huge lesson to be learned, and a lot of those listed companies have struggled in the last few years because the government initially had a program to really support growth of the education sector in Brazil by subsidizing student loans. Of course, as everyone well knows, the Brazilian government has had its issues in the last few years, and that has had a huge impact on the funding of such programs and issues for those listed players. So I think as you look at that model of trying to provide education at a low cost, there is a real sustainability issue to think about. So there's been a lot of mergers, and these education institutions really have to stay focused on the bottom line and growth and have public investors. So I think as you look at that model, I don't know that it's one you'd want to replicate. I think there are some innovations that cost issue has produced, like online education. So they've started setting up like centers. So, internet access is always a challenge in emerging markets. So doing online education, but not by doing it in your house, which is what we think of online education in the US or other mature markets, but having like pod stations that you can go and do online education in more rural areas, but everybody comes together. So it's almost like a virtual online. And using some of the MOOC type models where you have some education by maybe the PhDs are doing the things that are creating the content online, but then you have sort of like the community college model of maybe, lesser professors that can actually manage the classroom and teach that way. So I think those are some interesting innovations that have happened in Brazil as a result. But as I look at the model here, I think the big advantage long-term is the quality focus. So for me, as I look at the risks of IFC investing and lending to institutions, one of the things that makes it less risky is the quality focus here for Ashesi, which is when you have a quality focus, you're going to get your graduates jobs, which they're doing, and you're never going to have that backlash. And what's really tough for the entire amount of investment that can go into private education is when there's a backlash against for-profit education, because that backlash has a multiplicative negative effect. And so to the extent that we can encourage more and more quality, even if it comes at a higher cost, and I am a credit officer, but at a lower profitability, it means you have a more sustainable model because those graduates, it's not going to cause the social unrest that you see is happening in places where you don't have the quality and people are borrowing and paying for education and it's not getting them a job.
Okay, thanks, Anandi. And I have a question for Doug, and following up on Anandi's comment on online education. Laureate has a lot of experience with Walden in the US, and you've thought about bringing online to different geographies, Doug, as the leader of the institution. Is online education and maybe blended education as well a myth or a reality for Sub-Saharan Africa? Many people are thinking that that's maybe the solution to the low coverage rates and maybe the ability to bring programs online to a region where there's some limitations in terms of bringing up the additional capacity needed to bring up gross enrollment rates to maybe the 30% that we see in many middle-income countries around the world. What do you think? Is it myth or is it reality?
I think when people talk about online, there are so many things that they could mean. So, for example, the Brazil example of online, it's really just meant to be an affordable, accessible education that you almost go to a retail store to experience, and that's what they would refer to as distance learning. In the U.S., it can be people taking all their classes online, but they would typically be working adult students, often graduate students, for whom that's a good match with their work-family balance. Our students in Laureate, I would say young students, 18 to 22-year-old students, they do want to be on a campus if they can afford it. But of course, in Africa, we would be saying there'd be many people for whom that just may be a dream that can't be fulfilled. I would be worried that students who don't have some of the support mechanism may not get the most out of that education. And I would tend to think that fully online is something that will ultimately lend itself more to working adults, graduate students, those who are more able to get everything out of that education themselves with a little bit less of the surrounding support. We see this in the U.S., of course. There's been this phenomenon of the MOOCs, these massively open online courses. It's a brilliant idea. You can take a course from Stanford or Harvard for free. Very, very few students complete. 15%, somewhere between 5 and 15%, actually a lot closer to the 5. And the issue is that if you try to get that completion rate up, you then need to start providing support services, which then means it's not free anymore. The minute it's not free, the number of people who want it drops precipitously. So it's problematic to figure out where on the spectrum, if you establish online as the spectrum of essentially free content, like iTunes University or a MOOC, all the way through to like what we do at Walden, we have PhDs online. It can be 6 years. It can be $60,000. But in the end, you're going to have a qualification that's going to be extremely valued in the marketplace. Think about what a big spectrum that represents, and then figure out where on that spectrum are we talking about for Africa. If we're talking the need for traditional high school leavers, young people going to school, I think we're going to have to find some sort of a blend. And it may not look that different from that Brazil example. And then my last point would be on the comment that Vin made, though. In the end, if you don't have a willingness on the part of ministries of education to allow experimentation, and you used a great word, you said conserve. And it made me realize there is a point in the life of an organization where they're more about protecting and conserving their brand or their reputation or anything else. It's natural. And when you're a risk-taking, early-stage entrepreneur, it's more about inventing and less about conserving. I think it would be fair to say that education regulators are about protecting people from a lot of things, including innovation. So that would be the piece I would struggle with a little bit. But no doubt in my mind, what's needed for Africa is something scalable. Technology is clearly going to have to play a role in that.
Okay, thanks, Doug.
Thanks. Just one last question for Shonan before we open up, before we open up for the audience to ask a few questions. But sort of a two-part. What is the role of quality assurance agencies in promoting innovation? It's a good follow-on because, how do they not become regulators, but they ensure quality, but also encourage innovation? And then what's your hope for progress in African higher education in the next 10 to 15 years as a sort of a big picture final thought?
Every time I come to a conference in IFC, I realize how different we are, even though we are one World Bank. Some of the hints are already in the previous speakers. How do we scale up? It's nice we see a shining light of Ashesi in Ghana. How do we scale it up? What on the World Bank side, with our governments, our Ministry of Education, we tend to think about system, policy, institutions. And because of that, sometimes we become paralyzed. How do we act? Where do we start? So in the case of these regional projects we mentioned, the Center of Excellence supported by the World Bank, IDA, which is credit, interest-free credit, paid back in 30, 40 years. What is ACE? If we think about Ashesi is one shining light, let's think about what if we have 46 shining lights? Can we still keep them lit? How long can we keep them lit? So this is what our project is about on the World Bank. In the last few years, we have set up cross-African continent, 46 of these centers. They are all in different fields, some in climate smart agriculture, some in renewable energy, some in using insects or as food or feed, and some experiment on Internet of Things. Some try to, break through in textile industry. So very different mixed bag of those centers. We gave them a framework, very general guidelines. You have a budget, 5-6 million. You have 5 years. Go innovate. Think about what new program you can develop in all your niche areas. Think about how to use the partners creatively and how to work with the national systems, bottlenecks, and show us what innovation can bring. It's very difficult. You've already mentioned many factors. For example, they are not blank sheets. All the centers are faculty or centers within existing institutions. And for us to think that they will get autonomy they need, it was actually quite naive. And a lot of the centers are already encountering system-wide bureaucracy and bottlenecks from the university, from the country, Ministry of Education, from the higher education accreditation agencies. No? For example, when we develop a new program in biodiversity, agriculture, nobody even know what standards should be. And imagine you have to subject a new project, new program to the Council of Higher Education, let's say in Ethiopia. And how are they going to judge whether this should be approved? So quality assurance become basically inhibitors to innovation. This is a huge challenge we have. It's good to learn from the Ashesi experience that you're able to make some impact on the accreditation body in the Ghana National Agency. We would love to learn from your experience how collectively we can negotiate and bargain and break through those national agencies. What it means to have high quality programs for these centers. Not sure. What was the other question going for?
On a hopeful note, what's your hope for the higher education in Africa 10 or 15 years from now? What will be the changes?
I think if I do hope these will be actually shining lights, and that collectively, we are estimating ourselves in the team, if 1/3 of them continue a metamorphosis really into truly global leading centers in these areas, that will be a very good already for us. 1/3 could just die away, wither. Another third just become a regular old faculty center in what we see a lot in Africa. I mean, even that will be a very good outcome. And I think the approach of using those centers of excellence is still a good approach. For a long time, especially the World Bank, we have become complacent. And in the name of working with systems, in the name of being comprehensive, addressing only top-down policy institution, we tend to be stuck. We actually, in the process doing that, we are guilty of creating or multiplying those bureaucracies in the higher education system, which compounded the efficiency for the entire system. So I still believe that the Ashesi and our ACEs are a very good breakaway model, that it's okay to let's start with 1, 20 or 30 or 40 institutions, build them up. I think they will, if qualities, I agree with the previous speaker, if there's sufficient quality, and that itself is a scale up, that itself is branding. So it's still very hopeful. And that's, in a way, these projects represent a departure from the usual comprehensive projects we have in the World Bank. And I think we hope we learn from the private sector and these institutions to see how we make them sustainable, how we develop curriculum, creating a culture. And they have the resources, but they don't always have the know-how of these institutions. A few of them are doing very well, very active, but many of them are sort of a bit lost. And they say they're not used to the autonomy we give them. They kept asking, what do you want, what kind of consultant we should have, what kind of partner we should have, so forth. So it's a struggle, but we are hopeful.
Okay, thanks, Ariane. Now, we're going to open it up for questions. We have time maybe for 3-4 questions from the audience. I know many hands are being raised, so we'll hand it over to our colleagues from Ashesi Foundation.
Thank you. My name is Kwame Okran. I'm from Ghana. I lead business development for Olin Development, which is an energy development platform. All the comments that were made today are underpinned around sustainability. When you think about sustainability, you think about lowering costs. When you think of cost for an institution, you think about O&M cost, energy. What is Ashesi doing to spearhead, renewable energy as a solution to cut down on its diesel usage, because our Zoom Ghana has some outages, as well as encouraging the students to create energy solutions or support the existing solution that you might create? How do you see this tying to innovation, engineering, and sustainability overall?
Patrick, maybe you can address that one.
Okay, sure. So there are a couple of things that we're doing in terms of energy. One is just designing our buildings to maximize natural light, for example, so we're not using electric lights all the time, especially during the day. We have a biodigester that produces methane gas that powers one of the stoves in the kitchens. And then this year, we just signed an agreement with a third party that is going to install solar on our campus, that when it's up, we will be 40% powered by solar energy by the end of this year. And what we've done to financially make it possible is to do a sort of a build, operate, transfer model where they install, they own the equipment, they maintain it, and we buy electricity from them. And we've negotiated a price of electricity that is lower than what we're actually paying now per kilowatt from the national grid. So it will we'll get to cleaner power, and it's going to be also less expensive power. And then after 12 years, we own the equipment. So, and this is sort of our first foray, 40%. We'll see how it goes. We only pay for the power that they deliver, so we don't have technical risk, financial risk. And if it works well, we sort of continue to expand it across the campus and show other universities and other institutions that this is a economically viable way to go.
Okay, we have another question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Sturm, and after retiring from the IMF and the OECD, I had the pleasure and the honor to teach twice at Ashesi University in 2003 and 2008, and it's an experience I wouldn't miss for anything in my life. Now, my question is the following. From what I heard about the rate at which quality education is appreciated in Africa and the high rate of employment of your graduates, and I don't know what their salaries are, but I can't help the suspicion that the rate of return in this human capital investment seems to be very high. Not only the social rate of return, but also the private rate of return. And on the other hand, you have in developed countries, you have institutional investors and private investors who are desperately looking for profitable investment opportunities, given that investment rates of return on safe investments here are about close to zero. So I'm wondering, and I would like to address this question to the gentleman from Laureate and to Patrick, thinking about innovation, is there any way to bring these two parts together, that you leverage the high return investment opportunity in Africa with the desperate investors who can't earn enough to pay their pensioners a decent return, and bring those two together? And I know it isn't happening, and my question is, why isn't it happening, and what are the major obstacles that prevent this model from working?
Doug?
Sure. I think the scalable way to match capital, human capital, with financial capital that I'm familiar with has been essentially forms of student loans. And there are many of those, of course, government-backed student loans or private lending in student loans. In the U.S., there's a lot of interest in essentially income-sharing agreements. This is something that Purdue has offered I'd say a pretty bold experiment to say to a student, instead of paying tuition, agree to pay us a percentage of your future income. I think it's a very interesting form of technology, financial technology, to try to address this. I will say in our efforts to find scalable ways to get into student lending, even when we know that the economic proposition is very good, the default rates are very high. And is that because the education was still more costly than it should have been to begin with, and therefore the return for the student wasn't as good as we thought? Is it because there's really no good collection mechanism, and therefore students just don't repay? It's interesting, we were talking earlier about Brazil. In Brazil, the government had a big student loan program, which was very important, which they had to reduce. And now what you find is a lot of our competitors, universities in Brazil, offering their own student loans to students. In our past experience, the repayment rates were bad, and the ability to collect isn't an act that anybody feels very good about. So if you want to go after someone because they're not repaying you, it's problematic. So there's something still getting in the way of what I would say is otherwise a very pure and logical idea in the way you just expressed it. And I'm going to go home and think about that tonight.
Patrick, would you like to?
No, I think Doug covered it.
Okay, maybe a couple more questions.
Hi, good evening. My name is Celeste James, and I heard you mention this idea of pairing the academic training with vocational training in some way, so that the students are allowed to tinker. And I'm wondering, I don't think I heard you talk about internships, and of course that is a big practice here in the U.S. that allows students to tinker. So I'm just wondering, is Ashesi set up to ensure that students are able to do internships in Ghana or elsewhere in Africa? And if so, is that something that you literally support the students doing, and at what percentage do students get to participate in that?
We do, and currently 90% of our students will do internships before they graduate. For our engineering program, we've decided to make internships mandatory. So for that particular program, we're aiming to have 100% of students intern with companies in the country before they graduate. They're happening in Ghana, but they can also happen in other countries. So some students will go back to their home country for an internship when we're on vacation. We now have internships that are also happening in Europe. So Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch are hiring interns to the London operation. Most of those interns end up working in country when they graduate. A few are returning to London to work full-time.
Okay, thanks. And I think we have time for 2 more questions, maybe.
Thank you so much for an inspiring panel that has just spoken about education in a very different angle than what I've experienced. My name is Elsabet Tedros. I can say that I'm an ex-banker who is very motivated on talking about education. My question is twofold. One has to touch on finance. When it comes to education and innovation, a lot of the schools like MIT, such as MIT, Stanford, have a venture capital arm within the school. And that's one of the things I'm not seeing in education in Africa. There are standing schools in different universities, but you don't have a venture capital arm or something that monetizes that innovation that your students are accomplishing. I think people sometimes they look at what Africa can give out, but what Africa can receive, but we have to look at, I think, a bigger picture of what can we contribute to the world, and what is that to you as an institution. The second fold is, having been educated and graduated in Ethiopia, one of the things I was very fortunate to have as a mentor, I worked with my father's business since I was 12 years old, and that helped me. And when I came to university here, mentorship is a big component. That's something that's not existing at all from what I have seen. I know that in South Africa, you have student sponsorship program that basically links students with professionals. Is that something that you'd like to look at? Because I think mentorship is a huge component. Everybody talks about money, but the mentorship aspect of it, or how to shape your career, how to build your company is also critical. Do you look at it that way? Thank you.
All right, so with mentorship, we do that. Our Career Services Office actively seeks professionals who sign up to be mentors, and they get connected with students. So that's, we started that about 10 years ago, and it's sort of steadily growing. Venture funding, there are two things going on with that. The first is with the Climate Innovation Center. The World Bank is also setting up a climate venture fund, which will be separate from the Climate Innovation Center. So there's sort of a boundary between the two institutions. But startups that go through, the ideas of startups that go through the Innovation Center and get incubated can then apply to the venture fund. And if they're good enough, then they'll get the funding and sort of start to scale. We're also, we've also started a smaller, or we're in the process of setting up a smaller venture fund for students on campus, and it's funded by some investors from Silicon Valley who want to help Ashesi get into doing this, and that's just starting. It started this semester. We're going through the mechanics of structuring that. And it's modest, but depending on how well it does, we anticipate that it will grow.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one final question.
Sadly, I have the speaker. So I'm not from the bank, so I might not have the sector special knowledge. But I just want to understand two things. You said in the beginning that there is not enough market which can afford the education in the continent. But I just wanted to understand that what is special, what is the unique USP that you have, or the business model that you have, that you can provide education at relatively lower cost and still be able to give scholarships and maintain a running sort of university. And number two would be why it's not being replicated in other countries if we exclude the macro factors, Ministry of Education and all that, why it is not being replicated in other parts of Africa.
Okay. So I think, Doug, and you can chime in, I think Doug's comment had to do with the scale of the problem. If you're trying to reach a lot of people at a certain price point, most people can't afford it, right? Ashesi is a small institution. It's 800 students. We'll be at 1,000 in a couple of years. But compared to the challenge of the problem in Africa, I think that's what your point was. Now, in terms of why don't others replicate our model, I think that, as both Doug and I have said, when you're trying to achieve a certain level of quality, the price is going to be higher. What we're what we're hoping to do with our summer institute, and we'll learn along the way, is even if an institution cannot replicate low student-faculty ratios, if they can't have the same richness of quality, are there things in our model that would still improve whatever it is that they're doing today? So things around, curriculum, things around assessment. How do you assess students? I mean, simply the way you ask questions to students, the kinds of problems you ask them to try to solve, is going to make a difference in what they learn and how they learn. So there are things in curriculum, in pedagogy, in assessment that could be done to enable quality. And then there's something that we are starting to experiment with on campus now, not around curriculum and academics per se, but around social campus culture, is take this university and assign students to groups of 10 to 20 pods just throughout campus. And each of these groups has freshmen, upper class students, a faculty lead, or maybe a staff member. Now you've taken an 800 student university and you've structured something in it that looks like 20 student cohorts that are going to be together. Now, this is something that could scale, right? So if you took a structure like that and deployed it in a much larger institution, you could still get to, sort of a structure that enables students to belong to some smaller unit and be mentored in that unit. And maybe you even do it within some of your larger classes, right? So we're experimenting on something different, but it's something that if it works, we will be pushing as well as an option for people to achieve scale with quality.
Doug, do you want to add anything to that, or? Okay, I think we're gonna give Guy the bonus question, given that there was this small little conflict before. But I would ask both Guy and the respondent to be
extremely
short
brief
and to the point, because we want to make sure we have time for drinks and food and so on.
Patrick, I'm just curious. You are the star of Berkeley, of the Haas School. Your picture is in the waiting room of Rich Lions. But there is a second shining star coming up, which is kind of 10 or 12 years behind you, that comes out of Stanford, and that's the African Leadership University. And I was just curious whether you're talking to each other, whether they're learning from you. They have a totally different model.
We are. And, Fred Swanica, he's the founder of ALU. We've been talking since before ALA. When he was a student at Stanford, he reached out to me and we talked as he was setting up ALA. I'm on ALA's global advisory board, not on ALU's global advisory board, but we talk a lot. And we've reached out to them to participate in our collaborative as well. I'm really interested in seeing how his experiment with online learning works and to figure out what we can pull into our own institution.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists. I would give them a big round of applause.